evening, everyone. Thank you for coming to Stony Brook University School of Marine and Atmospheric Sciences in Southampton's lecture series. This is our third of 4 lectures this fall semester. And in a moment, I'll introduce our speaker. But before I do that, I'll mention that our final lecture will be on Friday, December 4th. And we'll have Dr. Amber Stubler here to talk about coral reefs and ocean acidification. And for those of you who don't know, Amber did much of her research here in Southampton and was actually an undergrad here as well. So I think it'll be a great lecture. Hope you can plan for that. But tonight, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Roy Price. Roy Price is a new faculty member to SoMAS. He's got a wealth of research experience. He did his PhD at the University of South Florida. He did a postdoc in Germany, the University of Bremen, as well as a postdoc at USC. Now, was that the SC in South Carolina or in Southern California?
Southern California.
That's what I thought. Okay.
LA.
And he's been all over the world studying hydrothermal vents and the geochemistry of these vents. Iceland, New Caledonia, all these very exotic places, all to address one of the most fundamental questions that mankind has sought to address from the beginning of its thinking is, where did we come from? How did life start on the planet? And so Roy's got his own interpretation of that, to answering that question, and I'm looking forward to hearing all about it. So without further ado, please welcome Dr. Roy Price.
Thank you, Chris, very much for that great introduction. I think it was really terrific. I'll just start off by saying thanks to everyone for coming. I realize that this subject is a little bit different to what you're used to hearing with marine science, and so I encourage you, if during the presentation some questions come up, please raise your hand, ask a question, let me know, and I'll be happy to answer it. The title is Searching for the Origins of Life in the Modern Ocean, and as part of that, I want to start by giving you some background information on what we know about deep-sea hydrothermal vents. Who's heard of black smokers and deep-sea hydrothermal vents? So nearly everyone. And I'm going to suggest that, or sort of lay the foundation to suggest that deep-sea hydrothermal vents might be a little bit too hot, a little bit too acidic for origin of life scenarios, as I call them. There are other possibilities, and I'm going to go through those in detail. So, number 2, the origin of life theory as is currently held by the community. Next, I'll go to where are potential analog sites. So we want to try and understand early Earth 4.4 billion years ago by investigating sites in the ocean today. And often that's difficult to find, equivalent sites. And so, but there are a few, and a couple of them are in the shallow sea, and that's really where my expertise comes in. I focus most of my research on shallow sea hydrothermal venting. Shallow meaning less than 200 meters, but where you can actually use scuba diving to collect the samples. It makes it much easier. You can collect a lot higher resolution samples. It's also much less expensive than hiring a boat for several $1 million. Finally, I'll wrap up by saying that I hope to convince you that there is a case to pay more attention to shallow sea hydrothermal vents, not only with respect to origin of life research, but also with respect to general geochemistry and microbiology and oceanography in general. There's not a... So we all, as I've said, most of us have heard of deep-sea hydrothermal vents. They were first discovered really in around 1977. And from that point on, there was a paradigm shift. There was a change in the way people understood life on Earth and the potential for life on other planets. Before this time, people generally believed that most life on Earth existed because of sunlight. Primary productivity in the surface water and feeding the the food chain from there. So it had immediate consequences for origin of life on Earth, as well as origin of life on other planets. And that's really because for the first time we realized the importance of chemosynthesis. So these vents are really in zero sunlight, and the energy comes from the rocks, from the hot water leaching the rocks, and the organisms use that energy to build biomass, and they basically form the base of the food chain, and you see all of these crabs living around, and you see some hot fluids coming out. So it changed our view of how life can exist and how life may have evolved. So this is a map up to date as of yesterday of all of the known submarine hydrothermal vent systems. So this is both deep and shallow. And they follow generally the plate boundaries. As you see, this is the Pacific Ring of Fire here, and the Mid-Atlantic Spreading Ridge. So to date, there are 688 submarine hydrothermal vents known that are under investigation or have been investigated in the past. Most of these are black smoker type vents that most people are used to seeing on TV. You see the black smoke coming out. Yes?
What does black smoker mean?
Black smoker is essentially what you see here. One more. This is a black smoker. So it's not smoke. This is actually iron sulfide precipitating out. The hot fluids have a reduced form of iron and sulfide, and as it comes out and mixes with seawater, it oxidizes and forms these. These are actually mineral precipitates, very tiny particulate mineral precipitates. And they look like black smokers, and so these are the most common by far. These are Riftia tube worms. They are existing with zero sunlight, growing off of, actually with the help of symbiotic bacteria in their tissue, helping them oxidize sulfide from the hydrothermal vents to get energy and build biomass. Any other questions? Okay. So this is our current map of deep sea and shallow sea hydrothermal vents together. As I indicated or suggested earlier, some origin of life researchers suggest that these are way too hot and way too acidic, really for organic molecule stability. They can reach temperatures of up to 400 degrees Celsius. The pHs are usually between 2 and 6, average of around 4, I would say. So acidic pH. Many of you may know that our current ocean pH is around 8.1. And so these are quite acidic and very hot, and also, in most cases, very high pressure. They're also very oxidized and sort of short-lived in geological timescales and evolutionary timescales. So you can have eruptions that will completely destroy this area, and all the life will be killed at that point, and then it may grow up in another place. So they're spasmodic, and many people suggest that it's not working as well as we originally thought for these types of environments. Okay. Yes, question?
What's the actual physical size of one of those vents?
They range in size from, I would say, 1 meter size chimney up to 15, 20 meters. So they can be quite large, So at this point, I want to sort of provide as much background as I can in the short amount of time on where the current state of the art or the current state of knowledge is for origin of life on the early Earth. Okay? If we think back in time, we understand something about what the atmospheric chemistry was like. There was a lot of CO2, a lot of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And as a result, a lot of that CO2, just like today, was dissolved in the seawater. The first oceans had CO2, a lot of CO2 dissolved in that seawater. And what that does is lower the pH of that seawater. And so with abundant CO2, the seawater was carbonated and acidic. So we think that the pH of the early Earth's seawater was about 5.5, quite acidic, right? This is an image, an artist's rendering of what the surface of the Earth may have looked like at that time, when we had an atmosphere, when we had our first ocean, and when life was first possible, that we think. One thing you notice about this image is that there's a lot of gas venting, right? This could be a source for all of the CO2, also sulfide, and different things. No oxygen at this point. The rocks you may notice are a little bit green and highly weathered. Okay, so now a little bit of geology background, hopefully not too much. One thing that we know today is that we have granite rocks. If anyone's ever been to Yosemite, for example, there's a lot of granite rocks there. Those came much later in Earth's history. Early Earth was really composed mostly, almost entirely, including the outer crust, of what we call ultramafic rocks. And if you look at this top area here, we have a spectrum, right? From low silica content, high iron. High silica, low iron. And those two are the main elements in our rocks today. And the range on early Earth, we think, was mostly what we call peridotite. These are ultramafic rocks. Ultramafic is just a word meaning lots of iron. Okay, so remember that, lots of iron in ultramafic rocks. And the general evolution of Earth's crust was from these ultramafic rocks on the early Earth to more felsic rocks. We see granites around today. Okay? Now, why does this matter? This is very important because there's a reaction that takes place when you add water to ultramafic rocks. Okay? The ocean crust is, just as a side point, but also an important point for later in the talk, our ocean crust is mafic. So it falls in between those two and is a little bit more silica, a little bit less iron. Okay? The reactions that take place for ocean basaltic crusts are different than those that take place for ultramafic rocks. So remember that. Today, our outer crust is a lot more felsic. It's mafic to felsic. And very few places on Earth have ultramafic rocks. That's what makes studying origin of life environments so difficult, because they're not around very much anymore. Okay? We have to try and find them. And right now, the interior of our Earth is the mantle, right? You guys have probably heard of the mantle. We have the crust, and then below that is our mantle, and then below that is the core. Our mantle rocks are mostly composed of this ultramafic rock, and in particular this mineral called olivine. Okay? This is olivine here, a very nice crystal. And this is an olivine-rich rock surrounded by ocean basalt, mafic rocks. So this is ultramafic, and this is basaltic. And I've actually brought a hand sample that you can pass around and have a look at. It's exactly the same as you see here. So what we want to see is this green ultramafic style rock. And this basaltic, this gray matter, is more like ocean crust. Okay? The reactions are different, though. When you add water and have chemical weathering, the products are different. And you'll understand why that's important in a second. So what we have is, on the early Earth, almost entirely ultramafic rocks, so very iron-rich rocks. Okay? We add water to that, and we're basically adding water to olivine. This causes a low-temperature chemical weathering. Okay? This chemical weathering produces magnetite and iron oxide, serpentinite, which is simply a word that means weathered peridotite, weathered ultramafic rocks. Okay? It also generates very high pHs, so pHs of around 11 or 12, very high pHs. This is as we'll see, this is a very important point. And it also produces very high concentrations of dissolved H2 gas. Okay? H2 gas, when it exhales from the water, is in the gas phase, but when it's dissolved in the water, it's also in the form of H2. Okay? It has very important implications, as we'll see. So what happens is, okay, the hydrogen, the H2, dissolved in the water, resulting from this weathering of the ultramafic rocks, can combine with that bicarbonate, the CO2. Remember, the early ocean has a lot of CO2 in it. When we combine these two elements, these two molecules, okay, hydrogen plus CO2, we form methane, CH4, abiotically. And that means without any biological reactions, no biology at all. You can do it in aseptic conditions, no biology whatsoever. Okay? That's very, very critical for the very first steps in the origin of life. You can also have a little bit more, and you can form acetate or acetic acid. Okay? This is another more complex, as you can see, more complex organic molecule. You can form formic acid, formate, and several others. And so this is all taking place where there's no life whatsoever. And on the early Earth, these are the very first steps towards life, we think, today. Okay? So ultramafic rocks reacting with water simply creates organic molecules. So you can imagine this happening on Earth, but you can also imagine this happening, taking place anywhere in the universe, really, on any other planet, other planetary bodies, as long as you have the production of H2 and CO2. Right? If you have those two, they can combine to form these organic molecules. Okay? All right. Another thing, another consequence of this, of these weathering products, is a pH gradient. So remember, the early Earth ocean is a pH of 5.5. And we're producing a high pH hydrothermal fluid of about 12, 11 or 12. So as those hydrothermal fluids come out into the ocean and mix, we have a very steep pH gradient. This is called the proton motive force. And what we know today is that most life on Earth relies on a proton motive force for synthesis of ATP, for generating energy. Okay? We rely on that as well. It's simply movement of hydrogen ions across a membrane. Okay? And we can ultimately get energy from that. So two things. Abiotic formation of organic molecules, particularly by combining H2 and CO2, and a pH gradient. These are the prerequisites to life on Earth that we think today. And so these serpentinizing environments really, hopefully, we're narrowing it down. We're starting to really narrow it down, and I think, to me, this is a very logical approach, to search for sites like this. So to summarize this somewhat complex concept, it seems that the last universal common ancestor, or LUCA, the microbe where all life sprang, we think, grew on the H2-CO2 couple and pumped hydrogen ions across a membrane, just as we see here. Okay? Mike Russell, who is probably the most famous origin of life researcher and a hero, personal hero of mine, you can quote him, he says, life hydrogenates carbon dioxide. That's the goal of life, ultimately. And this acetyl-CoA enzyme carbon fixation pathway, that's a complex way of basically summarizing these reactions. And there's another guy who is also quite famous in these areas. He called this a free lunch you're paid to eat. And that's because it takes no energy to fix that carbon. There are I think 4 or 5 other carbon fixation pathways. They all require input of energy to fix that carbon. But the acetyl-CoA enzyme carbon fixation pathway doesn't require any energy. And so you think about the potential for origin of life, we're really setting up the stage for an easy transition, in theory. It's all theory, right? So the point then is that serpentinizing environments are really natural analogs to early Earth origin of life environments, the places where we think it happened. Okay? This is the United Nations building, and this green rock, all of this green rock, is the mineral serpentinite. It's the weathered product of this ultramafic rock. Okay? The general formula is shown here. Okay? Question?
You used the word weather several times.
Right.
What actually are you referring to as happening to those rocks? Was it rain or the atmospheric conditions?
It's a very good question. Weathering, as we know it, can mean many different things, from movement of sediment to wind, from wind to water. In this case, what I mean is hydration of the iron in the olivine. It's a chemical reaction where we're simply adding water. And if you've ever been to Yellowstone, you can see this red and orange soils. Those are weathering products, essentially, from a chemical reaction of hot water with the rock. And that's basically what I mean. So we've established sort of what we believe should happen or should be present. So are there places on Earth where we can search and sort of try and get a better feeling, a better understanding of the early Earth conditions, what might have happened, and so on. And so there are places, in fact, where alkaline, hydrogen-rich, methane-rich fluids exist today. This is a map showing nearly all of these that have been studied extensively. And what you'll note is there are a lot of these solid red dots. Those are the terrestrial, the land-based hot springs. There are some famous ones. The Oman ophiolite is very famous. The Cedars in California is very famous. A lot of NASA funding goes to study life and chemical reactions in those environments. But remember, we want a pH gradient to be established. Right? So we want to be going from our, in this case, in today's world, we want to go from seawater pH of 8.1 to pH of 11 or 12 in a serpentinizing environment. Right? And to date, there are only 4 locations on Earth where this actually is known to happen. Okay? The Lost City, the Mariana Forearc, the Prony Hydrothermal Field, and the Strýtan cones in Iceland. Like black smokers, like these deep-sea hydrothermal vents, they're associated with a range of tectonic geological activity. And I'm not going to talk about that at all. I'll be happy to answer any questions if they come up. So, but it certainly helps, but is not required to have peridotite, okay, as we'll see. So the first one is the Lost City. It is located in the middle of the Atlantic, okay? And it's off-axis. It's called off-axis. If we imagine the spreading of the mid-Atlantic ridge is spreading apart, this is a few kilometers, I think, away from that spreading ridge. So it gets some heat from mid-ocean spreading, but really no chemistry, no volcanic gases, nothing like that. It's simply the weathering product, the hydration of this mantle rock. Okay? It's associated with what's called an oceanic core complex, which simply means there's a big fault there, and the mantle rocks have been exhumed. So the mantle rocks, this ultramafic rock, is now in contact, direct contact with seawater. So the serpentinization reaction is ongoing. And if you talk to anyone who is interested in origin of life, this is really the poster child. This is the reference case. Everyone wants to get their hands on these samples. Everyone wants to go on this cruise. It is really, in today's world, it's the most perfect site that we can imagine for this serpentinization reaction, high pH, high hydrogen, and high CH4, high methane. Okay? So again, it's off-axis. This is a 60-meter high calcite tower, mostly calcite. There's a little bit of brucite. So calcium carbonate, brucite is magnesium hydroxide. What happens simply is that calcium gets leached from the rocks, and it reacts with the carbonate in seawater and forms calcium carbonate. Okay? So very large, much larger than any black smoker vent that we know of. Very high pH, almost 12. The temperatures, as I said, it's getting some higher temperatures from the spreading ridge itself, but the serpentinization reaction itself is exothermic, so it generates heat on its own as well. Okay? So some of that heat is coming from the spreading center and from the magma, the hot magma there, but it's also the reaction itself that's generating some of the heat. Okay? Hydrogen concentrations are very high, 15 millimoles, let's say thousands of times higher than you would find in seawater. Very high concentrations of hydrogen. Must be coming from the serpentinization reaction, as I defined. Okay? And there is very high concentrations of methane as well. And they've done isotopic work on this methane to show, and I'll talk about this a little bit more in a minute, that the methane being produced here is mostly abiotic. So again, this is the poster child. It's really a fantastic site. It's about 800 meters deep. It's quite deep. I can't scuba dive that deep. It creates a problem.
Quick question.
Yes?
How was it found?
By accident, really. They were looking at black smokers along the mid-ocean spreading ridge. They had some, I think they had some downtime, and they sent one of the grad students, Deborah Kelly, down in, maybe in Alvin. If you guys know the story, please fill in. I think she was in a submarine, and it was the end of the day, let's call it quits, we're not seeing anything, and they were coming up, and she looked out the window and saw this giant tower, and found it, and they went back, sampled a few times, and now she gets millions of dollars of funding. So it really changed her life, no kidding. It changed many people's lives. Really fortuitous finding. The idea is that maybe these things exist all along the spreading center, and it certainly could be possible. There's ongoing research and searching for these new places. So the next place, I'll just, I don't want to take up too much time, is the Mariana Forearc. This is associated with a subduction zone, okay? And without going into too many details here, simply, we have subduction of ocean crust, and in this area we have these mantle rocks. We have these ultramafic rocks, okay? And these are faults, so these are cracks in the rock, and those weathering occurs, hydration of the iron occurs, creates what's called a serpentinite mud. It's actually like a clay mud that runs or moves up these cracks and then forms these giant kilometer-high serpentinite mud volcanoes. They call them mud volcanoes. They're really giant. Very high pHs. In fact, this place holds the world record for the highest pH of any natural environment. This is one of them. And here we see some of the calcite precipitates, some brucite as well. So very similar conditions. Serpentinization of the ultramafic rocks creating these conditions. High pH, high methane, high hydrogen. But again, it's quite deep, 4,000 meters deep in this area. Very deep, difficult to reach, very expensive. If only we could find a place in shallow water. And so that brings me to the next site. It's called the Prony Hydrothermal Field. It's located in the South Pacific, off the coast of Australia, and this little island there is New Caledonia. I have the circle actually in a little bit the wrong place. It's associated with what's called an overthrusted ophiolite. I'll explain what that means in just a second. It's also mantle periddotites undergoing serpentinization. So exactly the same thing we see at Lost City, exactly the same thing we see at the Mariana Forearc, and these land-based sites as well. Very exciting because it's only from 2 to 70 meters water depth. So well within even recreational scuba diving depths. So when I first started looking into going to this site, I found out that there was a French group, they call themselves the Hydro-Prony group, who were already established researchers there. And so they had started work on the site in around 2004, and I contacted them, asked if I could join one of their upcoming expeditions, and they said yes. And so I was able to get funding from NASA, an Early Career Collaboration Award, and I joined them and sampled in April and May 2014. The main thing was to characterize as much new chemistry as we could, because they had already done quite a lot of work. But one thing that they had not done was look at the gas concentrations and the isotopes on the methane to see if it's biotic or abiotically formed. And that's what I wanted to do. Okay? So this is the island of New Caledonia. This black material here is peridotite. So these are the ultramafic rocks. Very simply and briefly, what happens is you have collision of tectonic plates. One overrides the other. At the bottom of the one that overrides are these peridotite rocks. Then the top weathers away and gets removed by weathering, and you're left with this black material. And down here on the southern part of the island, those rocks are 2,000 meters deep, so they're 2 kilometers thick in that area. Very, very thick nap of peridotite. So I'm going to take you then to the southern part. This bay here is Prony Bay. Okay? Oh, I just want to mention also that it is protected. This whole area is protected. It's a UNESCO World Heritage Site. So permitting is not so simple. You have to be very patient when trying to get permits. So down in the bay, okay, here again is Prony Bay. We have mapped, they have mapped the types of rocks, the rock compositions. And we have serpentinites, peridotites, several others in this area. So that's basically all that crops out in the area. Okay? And they've investigated several sites in the lagoon, in the bay, but I'm going to focus on this one, which is completely in the submarine environment. It's called the Aiguille de Prony, which is French for the needle of Prony, the needle of Prony, and Japonais and Cowrie. Japonais is an intertidal site, so at sometimes the ocean water covers it completely, at other times it's exposed. The Cowrie site ranges from completely terrestrial and transitions into the submarine environment, so it can also be intertidal. This will make more sense when I show some of the pictures. But first, for the submarine one, right? That's what we're really excited about. Some work was done in 1980s, early 80s, and lots of scuba dives took place, and they sketched this tower, and this is fairly accurate. A 38-meter high tower of calcite. It's almost pure calcite. There's a little bit of brucite around the bottoms, these smaller ones, but it's mostly calcite. They measured pH of 11, very high pHs, and temperatures were warmer than ambient conditions, so warmer than the surrounding seawater, around 33 degrees Celsius. So this remind you of something? Right? A little bit like the Lost City, but only in 3 meters, 2 or 3 meters of water depth, depending on the tide. So I was able to go there. This is our boat captain. We get ready. We look over the side. The water is so clear you can actually see this brown stuff. That's the top of the cone. It's actually the top of the cone we're looking at. And then off we go. And underwater, this is what it looks like. We had a couple of days of very good visibility, and we were able to get a couple of wide-angle or long-range snapshots. This is one small piece of a tower that is really this big. So it's a really big edifice. And this area is the most active part. In fact, it may be the only active part on this particular tower. The white material, that's actual recently precipitated calcite. So fluids are coming out enriched in calcium, reacts with the CO2 in the seawater, and precipitates out these precipitates here. So this is, again, is exactly what we're looking for. What about the hydrogen and methane? We're going to get to that. But first, a little video. So here's the top of the tower. And now I'm just panning the camera down, and you can see it's really, really big. It goes as deep as you can see, 38 meters high. And then this is the active part. It's very sharp. Now you see why they called it the needle of Prony. And although recently active, you can see it's already starting to be encrusted by life. So this makes it very difficult if you're trying to get an abiotic site. In fact, impossible. What you can't see, though, is coming out of the tops of these, and it's maybe difficult to see here. There's a little bit of fluid. The fluid's coming out here. I have my sampling apparatus here. Fluids are coming out. So there are hydrothermal fluids coming out that you can sample. The Cowrie site, again, is transitioning. So these are travertine deposits that you will see in any of these locations. Where you have serpentinization, it's always the same story. You have calcium coming out. In this case, the calcium is reacting with CO2 in the air to precipitate out the calcium carbonate. When it's underwater, it reacts with the CO2 that's dissolved in the water. Okay? But the Cowrie site, it has these very large, it must be a square kilometer of hydrothermal venting. Really amazing site. And in the submarine environment or the intertidal environment, you have these small cones, also calcium carbonate. The Japanese site this is at low tide. At high tide, it's completely covered. But you also have hydrothermal venting. And in particular, what I found interesting is at high tide, the fluids here you can see are jetting out of this hole, right? But at low tide, there's no water coming through. So I believe what happens at low tide is the water begins to move laterally to the sides and then run out in that way. That's just a theory, but very interesting. And here, again, fresh calcium carbonate precipitates. Very exciting site. And now, this is swimming around the outside of this Japanese edifice, tower. You can see bubbles coming out. Those are free gas bubbles generated by serpentinization. And those gas bubbles have almost 40% hydrogen, H2 gas. You could light it on fire. There's such high concentrations. Free gas methane is up to 15%, also very, very high. So this is really exciting. It's a really interesting site. And whenever you have these free gas bubbles, and you can see this fluid has a lot of density difference with seawater. And so, to just sort of summarize the chemistry, again, I don't want to go into too much detail, but the major chemistry shows the salinity of the fluids are very low. This is sodium versus chloride, right, the two most abundant elements in seawater. And if we plot seawater, and for reference here is Lost City, the mixing of our fluids with seawater suggests a zero salt solution as an end member. So what this indicates is that meteoric water, rainwater, is falling on the island, circulating underneath the island, reacting with the rocks through serpentinization, and then coming out in our tower edifice. So very low salinities. We can look at the deuterium and oxygen isotopes on the water to determine if it's a seawater or a meteoric water source, and I'm currently working on that right now. I measured pHs from 9 to 11.2, temperatures up to 39, EH, which is essentially a measure of the redox conditions, so kind of the reducing or oxidizing conditions, were very, very low. So it's a highly reducing environment, and that's in fact what we want to see. That's what we would expect from this serpentinization reaction. Because all the hydrogen produced is actually removing the oxygen from the water by forming water, H2 plus the oxygen. Okay? So the Prony Hydrothermal Field is a serpentinizing system, but it's a hybrid system. It has meteoric water as a source. So it's different than anything else known. It's unique as far as we can tell. Okay? There's no other place in the world where this happens. My question was, is this methane, this 15% methane in the gas phase, is that abiotically produced? Any guesses? This complicated chart or plot is showing the carbon isotopic signature on methane. So this carbon has an isotopic signature. This side, this y-axis, shows the hydrogen isotopic composition of that methane. And past work and empirical data have shown that we can, when we plot data from all different areas, from biologically formed to thermogenically formed to abiotically formed, they fit nicely in, not so nicely, but somewhat nicely in these categories. Okay? And so M, in this case, is dominantly microbial. Methanogenesis. Okay, methanogenesis. Microbes making methane. That's not what we want, right? We want abiotic methane. Abiotic methane will have a completely different isotopic signature of that methane. Okay? This is the abiotic window. Okay? So this is really what we want. So it has a certain carbon isotopic composition and a certain hydrogen isotopic composition that fits very differently from a microbial trend. Okay? T is for thermogenic. Thermogenic. And what that means is some biological activity has produced some hydrocarbons and it's undergoing hydrothermal alteration that is turning those complex organic molecules into methane gas. That's also not what we want, because that indicates life was there before. So we want abiotic formation. So we want to plot in here. So when we take our data from New Caledonia, the plot's here. So very clear signature for the submarine site for an abiotic signature. Very exciting. The Japonais site, also an abiotic signature. Perhaps there's a mixing trend towards microbial with Cowrie as fitting in between those. Certainly, it's possible. This is not a smoking gun. More work needs to be done. But it's highly suggestive that this methane is abiotically formed. Okay? Very good. And so the model generated by Christoph Monen is that it rains on the southern part of the island. These rocks are all, this green is all the ophiolite nap, right? So these are the ultramafic rocks. Reactions take place, generating high hydrogen, dissolved hydrogen. That's reacting with CO2, generating high concentrations of abiotic methane. The pHs are very high, so pHs of 11. And then it comes out in the bay and forms these towers, which are immediately then colonized by the organisms. So this is the current model of the system, and I hope to go back at some point to get the final answers. So those three systems, of the four, I've shown you three examples, all related to ultramafic rocks. Right? Now I'm going to show you one site, the Strýtan hydrothermal system, associated with basically ocean crust. Okay? Iceland is basaltic rocks. It's mafic in composition, so it has not as much iron and a little bit more silica than ultramafic rocks. And if you calculate how much hydrogen and methane that can be produced from this rock, it's much less than expected for the other one. And pHs shouldn't be that high. It's located on the northern part of the island here in this fjord. This is the biggest fjord called Eyjafjord. So it's off axis like the Lost City. Right here's the spreading axis of the mid-ocean spreading ridge. The temperatures are high and the pHs are alkaline. Temperatures are around 78 maximum, 78 degrees Celsius. Very high. Okay? pHs are around 10.2. That is also quite alkaline relative to seawater at least. So potentially we have a pH gradient here to study. The depth is also only 16 to 70 meters. Okay? But as I said, the rock type is ocean basalt. So it's not ultramafic rocks being weathered. This is only mafic rocks. How is it possible if we don't expect to see high pHs? How do we get those high pHs? This is an outstanding question. It was first published about in 2001. The discovery and description of giant submarine smectite cones in Eyjafjord. A very nice title. This did not mention anything about origin of life. Okay, nothing. Lost City had not been found yet, in fact. That was in 2003. But subsequently, Mike Russell and others have written papers relating to origin of life and tying in this Strýtan hydrothermal system, suggesting that this is an exciting place to investigate with respect to the origin of life. And in fact, it's featured in one of these James Cameron films, Aliens of the Deep. If you rent this, you will see images of the Strýtan hydrothermal cones. But you can see it here as well. So again, I was very lucky to get some funding to go up and investigate these sites, and the idea is exactly the same. Understand how the processes contribute to the measured geochemistry, in particular those high pHs, because we don't expect those. The dissolved gases, are there any acetate or formate? Still working on those data. Is that methane abiotically formed? Okay, so just take you on a brief tour of the site. Here's the fjord, Eyjafjord, and there are two main sites. Big Strýtan, you'll see why it's called Big Strýtan in a moment. Strýtan is here. Strýtan means cone in Icelandic. At Strýtan, this is a bathymetry map showing that they're about, at maximum height, 40 meters tall cones in this environment. Okay? Around 40 meters. And they're aligned like so, probably related to faulting. Okay? This is an artist's rendering of Big Strýtan, big cone. And it's difficult to see. There's a little scale bar in here. This is 55 meters tall. 55 meters tall. Very large, and there are three main ones here. Just to give you an idea of scale, I've blown that up. This is about the maximum depth we were diving, and dry suit diving, and around 100 feet. And the top of the cone is around 16 meters. Okay? So we were sampling all along this, hot spring fluids coming out. This is kind of what it looks like underwater. Okay, the top of the cone here. This is the very tip, the very top. This is right at 16 meters. You see all of this shimmering water? That's the hot fluids coming out between us and that diver. Again, 78 degrees Celsius. And now, a short video showing the side of the cone. And right here, there's a lot of water streaming out. This is the biggest vent that I saw. You can see density fronts as the water moves up. This is the diver scale. And very strong flow. And this is recently precipitated material. So this is all fresh material here. It's all fresh. It's not calcium carbonate. It's actually called smectite clay. It's a magnesium silicate. Magnesium silicate. They believe that this cone is there because when we react the water with the basaltic rocks, we generate high concentrations of silica. In seawater, we have high concentrations of magnesium, and those two can combine and make magnesium silicate, and that forms this tower. Okay? So it's completely different than the other ones that I've mentioned. Some of the basic chemistry, again, pHs are around 10. Temperatures are really elevated. And we believe also that this one is a meteoric water source. This is, again, sodium versus chloride. Seawater is way out here. Lost City would plot here. And a very nice mixing trend back to 0, 0 salinity. So, again, the end member fluid that's mixing with seawater, the other end member, is 0 salt. It's meteoric water. It's rainwater, just like New Caledonia. There is evidence of element enrichment. For example, this is just two examples, boron and silica, that's enriched over seawater. So the rocks are being leached. And it's possible that it's also generating hydrogen, just not on the scale of weathering of ultramafic rocks. Okay? So we wanted to look into that a little bit more. So overall, the control on the pH is an interesting story. I found this from work or I figured it out based on work that someone had done for Norway crystalline rocks. And the idea is that on the middle of the island, in the center, rain that is saturated with CO2. Okay? Rain saturated with CO2, which actually in the dissolved phase is as bicarbonate. We call it bicarbonate. Okay? Seeps into the ground up here. As it goes into the ground, calcium begins to come out of the rocks. The calcium and the CO2 combine and form calcite. So deep down in here, calcite is forming. But at this point, we're completely separated from the atmosphere. There's no more source of CO2, but there is a source of continuous calcium. So once the calcium is reacted with all of the CO2, this basically removes what we call the buffering capacity of the fluids, and the pH is then allowed to go up to pHs of around 10. And that's really what's happening here. So the waters are coming in here, all of the CO2 is removed completely, moves along, comes out in the seabed, out of the seabed, and you have these alkaline fluids, so very high pHs in that way. What about the hydrogen and the methane? We have significantly elevated concentrations of both methane and hydrogen. Here is seawater. It's essentially zero in most places in typical seawater. And as you can see, our data plot sometimes quite high. This is several orders of magnitude lower than what we find in the Lost City. So it's very low concentrations relative to the Lost City. But nonetheless, there's still enough there to have some measurable components. And it's unclear how much would be needed on an early Earth if this were in fact taking place. I was able to, this was earlier, so this was in 2013, so I didn't have the lab set up in order to do the hydrogen on the methane, but I was able to do carbon isotopes on that methane. Question?
Could the potential rate of C4 spreading affect the areas where these hydrothermal vents occur? Because I'm sure you know there are different rates.
For this type of vent, that's more difficult to say. For vents like Lost City, yes, they believe that the slower the spreading rate, the more abundant these will be, because that has a higher potential to form an oceanic core complex, which exposes that mantle rock. Okay. In this case, I'm not sure. Recall that this is also an off-axis site, so it has only heat from that magma. But there's no chemicals coming in. There's no CO2 coming from the magma chamber. There's no sulfide. Okay? Sulfide is basically non-detect here. We don't detect it at all. So it does get heat, and that enhances the leaching of the rocks. But beyond that, there's not a contribution. Okay. So I was able to do the methane, the carbon-13, the delta-13C carbon isotopic analysis of the carbon in this methane, but I only am able to plot it here against methane concentrations. So this is not nearly as convincing as the other story. However, we do have some data points that are larger than this -20 value, and generally people would suggest, experts who work on it more than I do have told me that this is certainly suggests an abiotic origin for some of the methane that's in these fluids. Okay? I currently have a proposal to go back and do more work and hopefully can answer this question better. Okay, so to bring that then, it suggests that with high pH, elevated methane, elevated hydrogen, and possible abiotic methane, serpentinization of ultramafic rocks is not required for origin of life scenarios. We have what is required according to our theory, just by altering these mafic rocks. Okay? And that's very interesting and very exciting, because 60% of our Earth consists of these mafic rocks. There's very few places where there are ultramafic rocks, but the majority of our Earth's crust is mafic, is these mafic crusts. And so these are very interesting concepts to think about. So with that, I just want to say, again, we should be considering these shallow sea vent environments. We can have the same alteration of the ultramafic rocks that we have in the deep sea. We can have the same high pHs. We can have the same methane and hydrogen concentrations. We can have a hybrid system where we have fresh water coming through instead of salt water. What consequences does that have for origin of life scenarios? No one's ever considered that. before. What does the salinity play? Right? What role does salinity play? So I think they're very, very exciting, and I want to work on them more going into the future, and I hope I get that chance. With that, I just want to say thank you to my collaborators, the Hydroprony Research Group, these folks who contributed a lot of time and effort and analysis time, my funding sources for all of this work. And with that, I'll say thank you and invite any questions that you may have. Thank you.
Have you come to a conclusion with a high degree of certainty about the origin of life?
I think it's a very complex.
So the answer is no.
The answer is no.
Secondly, I saw that a lot of your funding came from NASA.
Yeah.
What is the interest that NASA has in the origin of life?
It's not only the origin of life, it's life existing on other planets. And as I suggested, imagine we have another planet that's entirely made out of ultramafic rocks with some water. That's one avenue that NASA would be interested in.
Thank you.
The slide that you had, the isotopes of hydrogen on the vertical axis, and there was the whether the abiotic production was over on the right.
Yes, yes.
And that whole mapped area of that range
Yes?
was like vertical across the whole spectrum or range of y-axis hydrogen isotope values.
These.
Yeah, that A. See the A area
Yes.
is entirely vertical along the whole
Here.
y-axis of values. Well, that stands out. Oh, it doesn't go down to the bottom tip by.
Maybe it's we're missing this. This is going to have to be expanded now.
Okay. But
Right.
it doesn't reach that tip at -30 on the x-axis.
No, not all the way down,
Okay.
but that's just a matter of scale, I suppose.
But why is that? To me, that stands out as a trend. Like it covers the whole hydrogen isotope range on the left column, on the left axis. Is that a trend to you, or is there a reason for that? Or
What I would only imagine is that we have two processes, would be my guess. One that forms up here, an end member. This is, to me, seems like an end member, and this might be an end member. So it's sort of a triangle. What the difference between the process that's here and the process that's down here, I don't know. The Lost City, the Oman ophiolite, all of that, they plot up here, mostly. And some other volcanic systems actually plot in here, but I'm not sure. This is based on empirical data, so data that people have actually measured. And I believe theory, if you calculated what it might be, would suggest the same.
what does that have to do with the source of the hydrogen, whether it's like from rain or not, or?
That can have an effect, yeah. That can play a role, certainly. Yeah, it certainly can. The hydrogen can also shift its isotopic signature much more easily than the carbon. So these are excellent questions that deserve consideration. Another question?
This is all pretty new data, it looks like.
Yeah.
Do you have fragmenters following you and looking for microbes and DNA?
No, we're sort of doing that ourselves. My French colleagues, Gaël Rousseau, in fact, is the microbiologist for the New Caledonia work. And they have 2 or 3 papers published on that. And there's one paper on the geochemistry. This Christophe Monin et al. is published.
And abiotic areas, are you finding any signs of DNA or RNA at all?
So it's very important to realize that one of the challenges that origin of life researchers face when going to a natural environment like this is the overprint of life is going to always be there. You cannot escape it. So when I say abiotically formed methane, that simply means that a reaction of hydrogen and CO2 has occurred in the absence of life. But that doesn't mean that it's an abiotic environment, and in fact, it's almost certainly is not. There's life everywhere in this environment. We can never separate out those two. Maybe in the lab. And in fact, Mike Russell does some of that work, where he takes aseptically, abiotically, reacts some ultramafic rocks, has it come out into a Haitian ocean of pH 5.5 and has some precipitates form, and he looks at the little chambers inside that form naturally that are thought to be the first cell walls, and so on. So there's people looking at that, but we'll never be able to get away from the biotic signature in a natural setting like this. Chris?
To form the methane, you need the hydrogen and the CO2.
Yeah.
But at high pH, the CO2 is evacuated. So, and you're working mainly at high pH water, so I'm wondering what's the source of the CO2 to form the methane? Is it in the ocean water?
I think so.
Okay.
I think it comes from that mixing.
Yeah.
The free gas methane, though. How would that be?
I don't know.
Yeah, I'm not. That's a very good question.
Yeah. I mean, certainly at the low pH, there's tons of CO2.
Well, probably at the high pH, it's not as bicarbonate. It's as
Yeah.
That's why I was wondering if you were finding advantages there.
Yes, yes, and in fact, it's very interesting. So, some of the microbiology, I don't have any of those data here, but the Lost City has a certain typical microbial signature, right? A certain kind of microbe that lives there called Volcanoes. And the Cedars, this place in California, the terrestrial vent, has a slightly different kind. So we have a terrestrial and a deep sea vent. And our site in New Caledonia is a transitional environment, right? A hybrid, as I've just said. It has characteristics of both systems. So it has similarities to the Cedars system with respect to the community of microbiology there, and similar to the deep sea site as well. Yes?
This will demonstrate my ignorance, but is the seawater in which you're doing these evaluations fairly consistent from site to site in terms of its composition?
Certainly, the Japonais and the Cowrie site, those are up in the northern part of that bay, right? And in fact, the chemistry, the basic chemistry of the fluids suggests that there's a river source. There's fresh water from the river as well. High tide and low tide, the river mixing is very different. And so there is some consequences to that. The seawater itself, though, in general, is going to be consistent. There's vertical differences. I mean, to say
I
that
know salinity changes.
I would say in the bay, in New Caledonia, it would be lower salinity in the top water because of the river inputs. They get a lot of rain there, so it's quite a lot. So it certainly could be much less. I don't think I've never seen any salinity measurements versus depth in the bay itself.
So for you, is this a non-factor, the degree of salinity or whatever other changes there might be in seawater from location to location?
No, that's definitely something that needs to be considered when thinking about these. Yeah, I mean, that's sort of one of the points that I made at the end. These are hybrid systems that have meteoric rainwater coming through the system. Does salinity have an effect on these reactions? Would it have had an effect on the first proto-metabolisms, the first protocells, and so on? Those are questions that I'm really not in a position to answer. I'm more of a chemist, a geochemist, and not really an origin of life researcher. I like the approach that I've done here. So I think those are definitely factors that need to be considered. Absolutely, yeah, all of them. Yes.
If deep sea exploration was suddenly made like completely accessible, would you switch your investigation down there, or is this still more advantageous?
Very good question. certainly the deep sea is incredibly exciting. It's a special environment. It's a different environment, right? Because there's no sunlight there. And so it's really driven by chemosynthesis there in these places with zero sunlight. Whereas in Prony Bay, there's so much productivity there. Healthy coral reef. The water is often very difficult to see through when you're diving because there's so much plankton and so much life in the water column that it's really difficult to see. The rivers bring in nutrients into that environment, so you can have a lot of stuff in the water there. It's a very different. I would take the approach of comparing the two. And people like me who have worked a lot on shallow sea vent systems often have a hard time convincing people who have only worked in deep sea systems that these are important as well. It may have seemed weird to you guys that I had that last slide saying we need to pay more attention. That's from years of being rejected. So I think really the approach is that they all deserve attention. If I had to pick one over the other, this Lost City site is absolutely amazing. There's also something to be said about when everyone wants to do that, but you have your own little niche over here, right? And I kind of like that as well. Any other questions?
Okay, well, thank you for joining Roy.
Thank you.
I hope you can join us again December 4th. And I'll probably say I see some new faces in the crowd. So we have a sign-up sheet outside. So if you're not on our email list, please make sure you add your name so we can alert you. Because next semester we'll have a whole new series as well. So thank you for coming and have a great weekend.
Thank you. Thank you, Chris. Sure. Sure. Uh-oh.
One science, one logistics diving. So, is there a difference in growth rates between your shallow water structures and like Lost City? Because they're kind of the same size age, 40 to 50 meters. Are they the same age? Do we know? Or?
The Lost City is something on the order of 60,000 years old.
What's that?
The place where I was sampling the Caledonia, I'm on the SoMAS website. Oh. Yeah. A lot of iron.
Yeah.
A lot of iron. You could actually use it as an iron ore.
Okay.
So the whole Lost City 60,000.
Yeah. So the other one we don't know. We have compartmentized data on bicarbonate in the water with Strýtan suggests that it is 11,000 years old. In New Caledonia, they, for many years now, have put a data log to one of the big ones. So down in the actually shut it down with this material. It's quite crumbly.
Okay.
They put it in there, and then when I go back, when I was able to pull that out, and the materials had a contact focus flow, and that's what it is. Every few months they go back, and this thing's completely covered up with wood, so it really goes in more than centimeters per month. It's really quite heavy. And those shallow ones, I think, are really limited by sea level. And waves. The deep sea one is limited by gravity. And if you look around the environment, you'll see a lot of them broken off and fall.
How are you doing today?
Good, thank you.
I have a question.
Yes.
We scuba dived to the blue hole, the
Yeah.
Dock Gusto blue hole. And so you see these stalactites
Yes.
and the other stalagmites
Yes.
going up and down,
Yep.
made out of calcium.
Yes.
my original thought was like, oh, this was land once, and now it got covered up, and now it's ocean. Now I think, no, maybe this was these
No,
venting.
your original thought was correct.
Was correct. Okay.
The blue
That was
hole,
the cave.
yeah,
Okay.
the blue hole is a karst feature, what we call karst, which just means dissolution of a limestone rock. It's a cave.
Oh, it's a cave.
It was a cave. So
The water leaches through the limestone and creates.
So here's how I think it happened. Of course, you should confirm anything I say. In the past, sea level was about where it is now. There was a pond of fresh water there, right, like so, on top of a limestone. So here's the coast. Here's a pond on land. When sea level drops, that fresh water lens drops with it, right? Because the fresh water has to sit on top of the salt water. And as that goes down, it dissolves away that limestone rock. And the bottom of the blue hole is probably around 140 meters, I would guess. And that's because in the last major ice age, or maybe it was before that, the lowest sea level is around 140 meters. So it's going to move like this, and then it actually moves laterally to the side. Freshwater does.
Okay.
That's how those form. And they are caves. As it rains and fresh water comes through, then just like a regular cave, you get these stalagmites and stalactites. Now today, sea level comes back up,